Welcome to Poetic Lines, where writers make the language sing. Today I'm thrilled to welcome Danielle Legros Georges, a professor in the Creative Arts and Learning Division at Lesley University and Boston's new Poet Laureate. Danielle is a talented writer, an astute reader, and a gifted teacher who brings great energy and intelligence to her role as Poet Laureate. For the next 4 years, she will work to raise the status of poetry in the everyday consciousness of Bostonians by acting as an advocate for the genre and creating a unique artistic legacy through public readings and civic events. Danielle has the wonderful ability to connect with people of various backgrounds and to honor both their dignity and their struggles. She was born in Haiti and grew up in Boston, and has also lived in Chicago and New York and traveled widely. Danielle describes her poetry as tackling a wide range of themes and asking philosophical questions that can lead to conversations about larger issues in life. Her poems have been published in a wide variety of journals, including Agni, World Literature Today, the American Poetry Review, and others. In 2001, she published a collection of poems entitled Maroon. Her awards for poetry include the Penn New England Discovery Award and 2014 Massachusetts Cultural Council Fellowship in Poetry. I first encountered Danielle's work several years ago when I was editing poetry for the Christian Science Monitor. Her word choice and moving narratives impressed me deeply, and they still do. I'm delighted to have her here to talk about how poetry can enrich people's lives and create bridges for greater understanding, no matter which city you call home. Danielle, welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. And a pleasure to hear your work always. So would you start with a poem?
Yes. This is called Poem for the Poorest Country in the Western Hemisphere. O poorest country, this is not your name. You should be called Beacon and Flame, Almond and Bougainvillea, Garden and Green Mountain, Villa and hut. Little girl with red ribbons in her hair, books under arm, charmed by the light of morning. Charcoal seller in black skirt, encircled by dead trees. You, country, are the businessman and the eager clerk, the grandfather at the gate, at the crossroads, with the flashlight, with the light, with the light.
I love the way you say, with the light, because in a sense that poem is saying to the little girl and to the man that they are so much more than what they think they are, and so much more than what the world says they are. And that's a beautiful concept. The poem also shows what poetry does. It shines the light for people. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about your projects as Poet Laureate. But the other thing the poem points out to me is your connection to Haiti. Tell us a little bit about growing up in Boston as someone who came from Haiti. What are some of the memories that stand out?
Yeah, I came as a child with my family, and like many other Haitian families, we arrived at the United States, or we got here as a result of political events in Haiti. I grew up in a tight-knit community of Mattapan here in Boston, in which we explored, into which we carried our own values, but also encountered larger American values. So it was a very rich community. Haiti as a country is a country rich in arts, and so we brought these values with us. And so I grew up in a very a very warm, connected, small Haitian community here in Boston. And while I was within that community, I was also, as a young person, along with my siblings, exploring the larger sort of American community.
Well, what you just described could be said about your work as a poet and your work as a professor, because you do draw on that experience of being part of a close-knit community and valuing diversity, and then also finding a unique voice in the larger society. That makes me think of a few lines from a poem you read, State of the City poem, 2015, Praise for Boston. And the lines that stood out in that poem are these: cable stayed, lit electric, wharves and new waves, and the complicated notions of freedom and forward, and the ease of summer days and sturdy neighbors. Chris, young terror of Sumner Street. Alana, eating a pear, already in 3rd grade. John, but call him Mac. Santiago, who yells louder than God, and Wendy, who yells louder. The specificity and the detail there really makes this poem sing, but it also reflects your values as a teacher and as a poet, because you wanted to capture all of the details, all of the specificity of those people, and the diversity that they are part of, which ties into your work as Poet Laureate, because there are 2 groups of people that you want to work with. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I especially want to work with kids, children, and elders, although I'm interested in working with everyone. And a 3rd group I'm interested in working with is a group of practicing poets in the city. We're a city with a wonderful literary history and wonderful practicing poets. But back to working with kids, I'm really interested in programming for kids, particularly in Boston public schools, and have had the good fortune to partner with an organization called Troubadour, which does literacy programming for in schools for BPS children. So it supports the literacy goals of teachers. It engages students in the arts and working with poetry, thinking about poetry, talking about poetry, writing poems. So that's the first group of folks that I'm interested in working with. Second group is elders, seniors. And this comes out of my own story. I lost my mother last year, and after a long illness, and my family required the use of adult day health centers and eventually of a nursing home. And I found that arts programming could really just support an expanded life for people within such facilities. And so when I became Poet Laureate, I thought it would be really important to create programming that could be offered to seniors and to elders, because I think they have wonderful stories to tell us. There's a lot I know I have learned from my own elders, and will continue to learn from people who are older than me. I too will be an elder in the not too far future. So I think that's an important part of what I want to do as Poet Laureate. And the third thing is to amplify the voices of poets and people in the poetry community. And there isn't, I think, just one poetry community. There are many poetry communities. There's certainly the spoken word, performance poetry community. There are poets who consider themselves community poets. There are poets who are affiliated with the academy or universities and schools. And so I'm really, I want to draw on all of the wonderful expertise and energy of folks out there to help sort of create this what I hope will be a wonderful Poet Laureate program.
Your answers are always so rich.
Oh.
And as I was listening to you, two things came to mind. The first is that when you're working with children and you're working with elders, you're giving them a new way to discover their voice. And you're doing what your opening poem did in some ways. You're introducing them to poetry, which says you're more than what you think you are, and you're more than what the world thinks you are. So it's an incredible gift to reach out to those groups, which are often overlooked. The second thought is that, as you said, the poetry community is not just one community. There are many different aspects of it. Why do you think that's a good thing, especially for people who might be feeling like, well, I don't even know if I want poetry. I don't know if I like it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think some people have had experiences that have turned them off to poetry, what I'll call poetry trauma. You may have had a pedantic, sonnet-wielding teacher or professor who was committed to the correct meaning or understanding of a poem and which turned you off. I mean, I hope that people haven't had that, but I think some people have this sense that poetry is unknowable or difficult. I think part of my task as Poet Laureate is to help remind people of the poetry they already know, that already exists in them. And I think everyone carries poetry within themselves. We often, the first type of literature we encounter is poetry. We're read nursery rhymes by our parents or our guardians. Often we reach out to poetry in moments of great sorrow or great joy, for weddings, for celebrations. And so there is poetry all around us. So I think it's important to remind people that they already have poetry. I also like to compare poetry to music. Music comes in all kinds of genres, right? Comes out of different traditions. There are musical traditions associated with different countries. So someone may like jazz but may not like classical music. Or if you're a classical music aficionado, you may like Dvorak but you may not like Bach. Or you may like rock over, I don't know, folk music or country music. Keeping with that metaphor, you may like Shel Silverstein, but you may not like, God forbid, Robert Pinsky. Or you might like Pinsky, but you may not like, I don't know, someone else, right? And so I think that I think that there can be a poet for everyone. Type of genre for everyone. Poetry is such a wide field, right? And art, of course, is subjective, and so we're going to bring all of who we are to an art form. And I suspect that we can find mirrors or reflections in the field of poetry, provided we have access to it, and
and that's why it's so important to engage so many different groups in the larger community, because you do provide all of these different mirrors for people, and they can find a mirror where they see themselves. You also have this wonderful way of helping people into a poem, because as you said, many people have been traumatized by a poetry experience. And you talk about strategies to approach poetry. Tell us a little bit about that.
Okay. I think I have two basic thoughts. I think reading a poem is important, reading it aloud, reading it several times, so that you can hear the music often that is found in poetry, so that you can delight in that purely for itself. And then there's an idea I borrow from the visual arts world and education. It's called Visual Teaching Strategies, which asks 3 basic questions. What do you see? What tells you this? And what more do you see? What else do you see? And so it allows you to encounter a work of art, sort of, right, just in a fairly straightforward way, and use textual support, right, for your ideas of what is apparent in the work. And then the 3rd question asks you to go a little bit more deeply into the text. And I think that strategy can help just about anyone enter a poetic text or any kind of artistic text.
And what's so helpful about those questions is that they do give people a framework to approach poetry, but again, they say that there is so much more here than what you might see initially. And poetry is so good at doing that. It shows people more of the world than they might have encountered so far. And it shows them the intricacy and the wonderful surprises. And that makes me think of a poem you told me about with seashells.
Yes.
Would you read that poem?
Yes. This poem is called Only. Nature hides the most beautiful design, the norm, the anomaly, the rare, the rarest, which is to say, the only. And aren't we each twins even? Only?
In the car ride over, you were telling me about how that poem evolved. Share some of that with us.
I was on a beautiful beach in South Carolina and just picking up seashells. And I was just remarking the extraordinary architecture of the seashells. And I also noticed that none was like another. So I was struck by both the nature's architecture, right? And architecture, and thinking about architecture in the built world, and this idea of singularity too. So what can be replicable in the built world doesn't exist in the same way in nature. None of us is the same. Each of us is an individual and special and rare, like those seashells. And so that poem came out of that meditation.
And that is such an important message for anyone, but especially for people who might not have encountered poetry before, or who might not have seen the singularity and the beauty in themselves. It's a gorgeous poem.
Yeah, thank you.
You were saying earlier that that poem also represents sort of a shift in your own writing, that earlier your poems focused on issues of identity, and you explored that for a while, and then you moved on to sort of larger and different questions. And that struck me because many artists go through a process where they start with one question or one subject that really drives them, and then they move beyond that. So tell us a little bit about your poetry now, and what are some of the things that you're interested in?
Yeah. Where I was interested in identity 20 years ago, I'm now interested in meaning, what gives our life, our lives meaning, sort of some of the larger questions, if they are indeed larger, of what it means to be human, what it means to connect, what happens to us, as we develop, And so those are the questions, I guess, questions of ontology, to use a philosophical term, and of the sort of the nature of life, the deep nature of life, and the mysteries of life as well.
That reminds me of a comment you made about dreams and how dreams will often spark poems for you. No one else has said that.
Yeah.
And I loved what you had to say about the way dreams work and the way poems work and the way people think. So please share that.
Yeah, I think what dreams and poetry have in common is this ability to leap. In dreams, things don't progress, or at least in my dreams, they don't progress in a logical fashion. You know, you can go from, you know, being on a cliff to being sort of in an ocean full of, you know, silver fish, right? In one instant of a dream. So this ability to make these grand leaps and still have things make sense, I think, is a wonderful part of dreams. And I think the poems that I find very appealing are able to jump from, you know, to jump and leap and move very quickly and to connect what seemingly disparate elements or ideas. Yeah.
And that idea is very freeing for people because so often you get into a routine, you get into a way of thinking, and you may forget that there are other options, that you can leap. But poetry does leap in so many ways, and it can help you leap into someone else's experience.
Yes.
Just as in your opening poem, you helped people leap into the experience of that little girl.
Yeah.
And that man. You created a bridge for people.
Yeah. I think poetry and art in general allows for empathy. It allows us to step into the shoes, into the experience, into the mind, if you will, of another. And it allows us to do that with some safety and distance, right? Poetry already is a step removed from, I think, from experience and art. And so there's space in which to encounter the other, if you will, or a different experience.
And at this point in time, that is so incredibly valuable because so often there isn't understanding or even empathy. But you hear a poem about someone's experience, and that gives you the opportunity to see things in a new light.
Yeah. Yeah, and I want to go back to the poem for the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. That poem came out of a sense, or the reality actually, of Haiti's, certainly in the mainstream Western media, constantly being called the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, as if it were its last name. And so I thought, this is not the only metric. This is not Haiti's only metric. There are also little kids who go to school. There are also people engaged in building their businesses and families and so on. And so I wanted to, in some ways, respond to that stereotype that was being perpetuated by mainstream U.S. media. I had to take it on. I had to adopt the name in order to, in some ways, challenge it, to begin to deconstruct it. And so that poem came out of that feeling for me that I had to respond, as a Haitian, to the representation of Haiti in the U.S. media, in the mainstream U.S. media.
What you said about that label becoming almost a last name applies to anyone who really feels labeled, that the phrase other people use about you can begin to feel like it is your name.
Right.
And when you internalize that, that's when a lot of devastation can happen.
Yeah.
But poetry can give you a new last name or can help you see other possible names.
True. Yeah. It is a great place of inquiry, I think. It certainly was for me as a younger person, and as I was negotiating U.S. culture, Haitian culture. I needed this, I needed a zone in which to work out my questions, and so that space was very meaningful to me.
And those poems of yours are very meaningful to anyone who reads them. So thank you for doing all that work and for your attention to detail. Would you read one more poem to close the show?
Yes. Still Life with Orbs. Between the thing and the name of it is a world, and a world behind this world. There is my mask placed on the table. There is the wooden tabletop and the space beneath it. There's an orange on the floor when it should be on the table, in the yellow basket meant for oranges, but which contains a cat, licking one front paw as if nothing were. What do cats know of manners? What do birds know of water, unless they plunge their beaks into it, breaking some poor fish's sleep? What do fish know of birds, except the slash of bill, the sudden flash, the stop?
Well, thank you for breaking our sleep and for shining your light.
Thank you, Elizabeth.